The microphone was still warm in my hand when my wife stood up, raised her glass, and toasted to another man before she ever got around to toasting to me. My name is Kevin. I'm the kind of person who plans things carefully, who likes things to go the way they're supposed to go. And that night, my 40th birthday, a backyard full of string lights and 40 of our closest friends, I had genuinely believed things were going exactly the way they were supposed to. I'm 40 years old. I manage commercial accounts for a regional bank, the kind of job that's taught me to read people across a desk in about 90 seconds, who's telling the truth about their numbers, who's hoping I won't ask the follow-up question. 6 years married to Brittany, together 9. We'd built what I genuinely believed was a strong, stable life, the kind of marriage that made other couples ask us, half joking, half serious, what our secret was. Standing near the dessert table that night, watching my wife lift her glass toward a man I barely knew, I had the distinct, vertiginous sense that whatever secret we supposedly had wasn't the one I'd always assumed. "I just want to say," Brittany said, glass raised, voice carrying easily across the yard in that confident, theatrical way she had at parties, that none of tonight would have come together without Aaron. He helped me plan basically everything. The caterer, the lights, all of it. "Aaron, seriously, thank you. You're the best." Laughter, a few scattered claps. I clapped too, because that's what you do, even when something cold and unfamiliar is settling into your stomach. Aaron, Brittany's coworker, a name I'd heard maybe a dozen times over the past year, attached to a face I could now match for the first time, since apparently he'd been invited to my own birthday party without my full awareness of who he actually was. Then, almost as an afterthought, glass still raised, Brittany added, "And happy birthday to Kevin too, obviously. 40 years old. Crazy. Obviously. Crazy." 2 words doing the work of an entire toast that should have been mine. I smiled anyway, because 40 guests were watching, because making a scene at my own birthday party over a toast felt small and petty, even as something in my chest told me it wasn't small at all. About an hour later, I went looking for her to cut the cake, and she wasn't anywhere in the backyard, wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't with her sister, who shrugged when I asked, distracted by her own conversation. I checked the driveway. Her car was still there. I found Jordan, my best friend since college, leaning against the fence with a beer, watching the party with the particular stillness of someone who's noticed something and is deciding whether to say it out loud. "Have you seen Brittany?" I asked. Jordan hesitated, just slightly. "Haven't seen her in a bit. Aaron's gone too, now that you mention it." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't suspicion yet, not fully. It was something more like a held breath, the particular unease of noticing 2 absences that happened to line up. She came back almost an hour later, walking up the side path from the direction of the street rather than the backyard. Hair slightly mussed in a way she explained, immediately and a little too fast. As we walked down to get more ice, the cooler ran out. Aaron reappeared a few minutes after her, from the opposite direction. I cut the cake. I blew out the candles. I smiled for the photos. And underneath all of it, a quiet, persistent thought had lodged itself somewhere I couldn't yet dislodge it. Something about tonight doesn't add up, and I don't yet know how much. I had no idea, standing there with frosting on a paper plate and 40 people singing slightly off-key, that this particular birthday would mark the last night I believed, without reservation, that my marriage was exactly what it appeared to be. For the first few days after the party, I told myself I was overreacting. People help plan parties. Coworkers run errands together. Hair gets mussed at outdoor gatherings for 100 boring reasons. I'm a careful person by nature, but careful doesn't mean paranoid, and I didn't want to become the kind of husband who turned a birthday toast into a federal investigation. But careful also means I notice patterns, and once I started noticing, I couldn't stop. Aaron's name, it turned out, had been present in our household for longer than I'd consciously registered, woven into Brittany's daily conversation with the casual frequency of someone who'd simply become part of her ordinary landscape. Aaron thinks the new branding direction is a mistake. Aaron covered my Tuesday meeting. Aaron's going through a rough divorce. Poor guy. I'd absorbed all of it the way you absorb background noise, without registering that the noise had a shape. In the 2 weeks following the party, Brittany's phone, which had always lived openly on whatever surface was nearest her, started living in her bag instead, not hidden exactly, just relocated somewhere slightly less visible. She started taking calls in the car, engine running in the driveway, rather than walking in and continuing the conversation inside the house the way she always had. Our Thursday nights had been ours for years, a standing dinner reservation at the same Italian place near downtown, a ritual we'd kept since our second year of marriage. 2 Thursdays in a row that month, she canceled. Late deadline, she said the first time. Aaron and I have to finish this deck, she said the second time, which struck me, even then, as an oddly specific detail to volunteer for an excuse that didn't require one. I sat alone at our usual table the second Thursday, the host giving me a sympathetic look as he seated me at our regular booth for one, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel over a missed dinner. Not just disappointment, but a kind of low, persistent unease that followed me home and sat with me for the rest of the night. I called Jordan a few days later, ostensibly just to catch up, though we both understood, within the first few minutes, that this wasn't really a catching-up call. "You've been weird since the party," Jordan said. No preamble, the bluntness I'd always appreciated about him even when it was inconvenient. "What's going on?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Brittany's been distracted. Canceling things. Mentioning Aaron constantly. I don't have anything concrete, just a feeling." "For what it's worth," Jordan said slowly, "when I was looking for her at the party, before she came back up that side path, I walked around to the front of the house, just checking, and her car was still in the driveway, but Aaron's car was gone from where it had been parked on the street. Came back maybe 10 minutes before she did." I hadn't known that detail. It sat in my stomach like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading slowly outward. "You think something happened that night?" I asked. "I think something's happening, period," Jordan said. "I don't know if it's that night specifically. But you're not imagining the weirdness, if that's what you're asking me." That conversation didn't give me proof of anything, but it gave me permission to stop performing calm with myself, which turned out to matter more than I expected. The next development arrived almost a month after the party, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, while Brittany showered upstairs and I sat in the kitchen scrolling through emails on the shared laptop we used for household bills. A notification popped up, her personal email, still logged in from some earlier session, a single new message from a name I now recognized instantly: Aaron. I want to be honest about the hesitation I felt before opening it, because it wasn't nothing. Some part of me still believed, even then, that opening that email crossed a line I hadn't yet earned the right to cross. That suspicion alone didn't justify violating the basic privacy I'd always extended to my wife without a second thought. I opened it anyway. It wasn't damning on its own. A few lines about a work project, a joke about their manager, nothing that screamed affair if you read it cold. But the tone was wrong. Too easy. Too familiar. The rhythm of two people who'd built an entire shorthand together that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, "Still thinking about Saturday. We should do that again sometime." Saturday, the day of my birthday party. I closed the laptop and sat very still in the kitchen, listening to the water running upstairs, feeling something shift permanently inside my chest. Not into certainty yet, but into a different category of doubt, the kind that doesn't fully recede once it arrives. Looking back now, that line, "Still thinking about Saturday," was the first moment I should have stopped giving every benefit of the doubt and started asking the harder questions out loud. I didn't, not yet. I told myself I needed more than one ambiguous sentence in an email before I tore my marriage open over it. Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern solidified in ways I could no longer rationalize individually. Brittany started attending what she called team happy hours with increasing frequency, always including Aaron, always running later than seemed proportional to the actual event. She grew distant in small, specific ways, quicker to end conversations, slower to make eye contact during them, the particular evasiveness of someone managing 2 separate inner lives and growing tired from the effort of keeping them apart. One evening, washing dishes side by side, the most mundane domestic scene imaginable, she said something that stopped me mid-motion. "Do you ever feel like we just go through the motions now? Like we used to actually talk, and now we just coexist?" It was the kind of comment that, 6 months earlier, I would have taken entirely at face value. A normal marital observation, the kind every long-term couple makes occasionally. Instead, hearing it now, against the backdrop of everything else accumulating, it landed differently. Not as an invitation to reconnect, but as the beginning of a justification she was quietly constructing for herself. "I don't think we're just coexisting," I said carefully. "But I'm open to talking about it, if something feels off to you." She didn't answer that directly. She just rinsed another plate and changed the subject to something about her sister's upcoming move, and I stood there with a dish towel in my hands, turning her unfinished question over like a stone with something living underneath it. The email line, "Still thinking about Saturday," wouldn't leave me alone. I replayed it during my commute, during meetings where clients were explaining their cash flow problems, and I was nodding along on autopilot, during the quiet hour before sleep when my mind, unsupervised, kept returning to the same unresolved thread. I decided, finally, to do something I'd been avoiding. I asked Brittany directly, on a Sunday morning over coffee, in a tone I tried hard to keep neutral. "What happened the night of my birthday party, when you and Aaron were both gone for a while?" She didn't flinch exactly, but there was a half-second delay before she answered, the kind of delay that comes from constructing a response rather than retrieving a memory. "We walked to the gas station for ice, like I told you. The cooler ran dry, and we didn't want to interrupt the party to make a big announcement about it." "Together? For an hour?" "It wasn't an hour, Kevin. Maybe 20 minutes. And yeah, together, because it was dark and I didn't want to walk alone." She set her mug down with a little more force than the gesture required. "Why does this matter so much suddenly?" "It's been weeks. Because Jordan said Aaron's car was gone from the street, and you came back from a completely different direction than the gas station would have put you." Something flickered across her face, not quite panic, but close to it, quickly smoothed back into irritation. "I don't know what Jordan thinks he saw. We got ice. That's what happened." I let it go, that morning, not because I believed her, but because I understood, watching her face carefully, that pushing further wouldn't produce honesty. It would just teach her to be more careful about what she said next time. I'd learned, across a decade of reading clients across a desk, that people rarely confess to pressure. They confess to evidence. So I started building some. I'm not proud of everything I did over the following 3 weeks, and I want to include that honestly, because the version of this story where I behave perfectly throughout isn't accurate. I started checking Brittany's location through the shared family app we'd set up years earlier for entirely innocent reasons. Knowing when to start dinner, coordinating pickups. I'd never once used it to surveil her before. Now I checked it daily, sometimes hourly, watching a small blue dot move through the city in patterns I tried to memorize and cross-reference against what she'd told me. Twice, the dot lingered at a coffee shop downtown during hours she'd described as team meetings. Once, it stayed parked for nearly 2 hours at an address I didn't recognize, in a residential neighborhood nowhere near her office. I called Jordan and asked if he'd help me figure out whose address that was. "You sure you want to go down this road?" Jordan asked, not judgmental, just genuinely checking. "Once you know, you know. There's no halfway point after that." "I already know enough to not be able to stop," I told him. "I just need to know exactly what I'm dealing with." Jordan, it turned out, had a cousin who did property research for a local title company, and within a day, we had a name attached to the address: Aaron's. Not his office, his apartment. 2 hours, on a Wednesday afternoon, in Aaron's apartment, during a window Brittany had described to me that same evening as stuck in back-to-back meetings, barely had time to eat lunch. I sat with that contradiction for a long time that night, lying beside her in the dark, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, performing an inventory of everything that had accumulated since the party. A public toast that prioritized Aaron over her own husband, a missing hour with a flimsy explanation, an email referencing Saturday with unmistakable intimacy, a pattern of location data that flatly contradicted her stated schedule, and now 2 full hours inside another man's apartment. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost clinical in its coldness, that I was no longer investigating a suspicion. I was documenting a pattern that had already, quietly, become a parallel life. The following week brought the detail that finally tipped me from quiet observation into active pursuit of undeniable proof. Brittany mentioned, almost in passing while we ate dinner, that she'd be attending an industry conference the following month, 2 nights, out of state, a trip she described with the same flat efficiency she used for any routine work travel. "Who else is going?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully even. "Couple people from the team. The usual crew." "Aaron." A half-second pause again. That same tell I'd started recognizing as reliably as a fingerprint. I think so. Why does it matter? Just curious, I said, and let the conversation move on, while internally registering that this conference, whatever it actually was, represented an opportunity to either confirm or finally dismantle everything I'd been quietly assembling for weeks. I called Diane, a divorce attorney a colleague at the bank had once recommended during an entirely unrelated conversation about a difficult client situation, and scheduled a consultation for the following week, not because I'd decided anything irreversible, but because I understood, the same way I understood any complex financial situation, that I needed clarity on my options before I did anything that couldn't be walked back. Document everything you have so far, Diane told me during that first call. Location history, the email, anything concrete. If this conference is what you suspect it might be, getting clear evidence there could matter significantly, both for any eventual divorce proceedings and for understanding the full scope of what you're dealing with, including anything financial that might be tangled up in it. That last phrase, anything financial, would turn out to matter more than I understood in that moment. The 3 weeks leading up to the conference were the strangest stretch of quiet surveillance I'd ever conducted in my own life, made stranger by how ordinary everything else around it continued to feel. I went to work. I closed 2 significant commercial accounts. I came home and ate dinner across the table from a woman I was now actively building a case against, all while maintaining a surface of normalcy that occasionally felt, even to me, deeply unsettling. Diane had suggested, gently, that if I wanted to understand the full picture before confronting Brittany, I should look beyond just the affair itself. Specifically, she'd mentioned, infidelity sometimes traveled alongside financial irregularities, particularly when shared accounts and credit cards were involved. I hadn't considered this angle at all until she raised it, and once she did, I felt almost embarrassed at how completely it had escaped my notice, given that financial scrutiny was literally what I did for a living, professionally, for other people's accounts every single day. Going through our joint credit card statements with fresh eyes, rather than the cursory monthly glance I usually gave them, revealed a pattern I'd somehow overlooked for months. Recurring charges at a hotel about 40 minutes outside the city, never large amounts. Always timed to afternoons when Brittany had told me she was working late or running errands. 11 separate charges over the preceding 7 months, totaling just under $3,000, quietly absorbed into a credit card statement I'd apparently been signing off on without truly reading. I sat with that discovery for a long time, feeling something tighten in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet, something closer to the specific, hollow sensation of realizing a problem had been visible the entire time, hiding in plain sight inside documents I reviewed professionally every single day for a living, and I'd simply never thought to apply that same scrutiny to my own life. I called Jordan that evening. There's a hotel. Recurring charges for 7 months. I think this has been going on a lot longer than just since the party. Jordan was quiet for a moment. You doing okay? No, I admitted, but I'm functional. I need to keep being functional for a little while longer. The conference arrived 2 weeks later. Brittany packed for it the way she packed for every work trip. Efficient, unremarkable, 2 nights' worth of clothes folded into the same carry-on she always used. I drove her to the airport that morning, kissed her goodbye in the drop-off lane with a composure that, looking back, I'm still not entirely sure how I managed to sustain. What Brittany didn't know was that Jordan, at my request, had booked a flight to the same conference city that same afternoon, ostensibly for an unrelated personal trip he'd casually mentioned to a few mutual friends as cover, and had agreed, with the kind of loyalty that goes beyond ordinary friendship, to simply be present, to document whatever needed documenting, while I stayed home and waited for updates I both desperately wanted and dreaded receiving. The first message from Jordan came that evening, confirmed Aaron's here too. Saw them both check into the conference hotel, separate rooms on paper, but I watched her walk into his room around 9 p.m. Hasn't come out yet. I read that message standing alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where, months earlier, Brittany had toasted to Aaron in front of 40 of our friends before remembering to mention my own birthday. The symmetry of it struck me even through the haze of pain. How much of this story had unfolded in ordinary domestic spaces that should have been safe, made strange and contaminated by what I now understood had been happening underneath the surface of our life for the better part of a year. A second message arrived close to midnight. She just left his room. Got some photos, time-stamped, for what it's worth. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat with my phone, scrolling through the time-stamped photographs Jordan had sent. Nothing graphic, nothing that needed to be, just a clear image of Brittany leaving a specific hotel room door at a specific time. More than enough, combined with everything else I'd already gathered, to constitute undeniable proof rather than circumstantial suspicion. The following day, while Brittany was still at the conference, I went further than I'd gone before. I'm not proud of this either, but I want to include it honestly. I used a saved password from an old shared account to access an email Brittany had set up years earlier for a freelance side project, an account I knew existed but had never once had reason to check. Buried in an old folder, I found a thread between Brittany and Aaron stretching back nearly 10 months, far longer than I'd assumed, far more detailed than the single ambiguous line I'd found weeks earlier. The thread documented, with uncomfortable specificity, the actual beginning of things. A work trip 10 months earlier, a moment of vulnerability after Brittany had a difficult performance review, Aaron's attentive response to that vulnerability, and from there, a slow, deliberate escalation that included exactly the kind of hotel meetings the credit card statements had already revealed, plus several references to keeping things low-key, specifically because, as one message put it, Kevin would never think to look here. That sentence, Kevin would never think to look here, landed harder than almost anything else I'd discovered. It wasn't just betrayal. It was betrayal calibrated, specifically, around my own blind trust, my own predictable patterns, weaponized against me with what felt like deliberate precision. I called Diane the next morning and told her everything. The hotel charges, the conference photographs, the email thread, the 10-month timeline. I think I have enough, I told her. I think I'm ready to confront her, and I want to be legally protected before I do. You're in a strong position, Diane said. Document everything you've just described to me in writing today. Send me copies of what you can, and let's talk through exactly how you want to handle the confrontation itself, because how you approach this conversation matters for what comes afterward. Brittany came home from the conference 2 days later, tired and distracted in a way she chalked up to back-to-back sessions, kissing me hello with the same casual affection she always did, completely unaware that I now knew, in exhaustive and specific detail, exactly what those 2 nights had actually contained. I waited until that Saturday, deliberately, to give myself time to organize everything Diane and I had discussed, and to make sure I confronted her from a place of controlled clarity rather than raw, reactive emotion. I laid the evidence out on our dining room table that morning. The credit card statements highlighted in yellow, printed copies of the email thread, the time-stamped photographs from Jordan, everything arranged in the kind of clean, methodical presentation I might have used for a client review. We need to talk, I said, and I need you to actually listen before you say anything. Brittany's eyes moved across the table, and I watched the specific moment recognition hit. Not confusion, not the slow dawning of someone genuinely unsure what was happening, but the swift, total collapse of someone who instantly understood exactly what they were looking at. Kevin, I can explain. 10 months, Brittany. The emails go back 10 months. The hotel charges are right here, 11 of them. I have photographs from the conference. I know you were in his room for over 2 hours on Thursday night. I'm not asking you to explain anything. I'm telling you what I already know, completely. Her face went through several rapid stages. Shock first, raw and unguarded. Then a flash of something defensive, and finally, as she sat down slowly at the table, something that looked almost like relief, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing an enormous weight and is finally, terribly, allowed to stop. I don't even know where to start, she said quietly. Start with the truth. All of it. I've earned that much, at minimum. She was silent for a long moment, hands pressed flat against the table on either side of the printed evidence, and when she finally looked up, something in her had genuinely shifted. Can I just talk? Not to make this better. I know there's nothing that makes this better. I just need you to actually hear how it happened, even if it changes nothing about what comes next. It started almost a year ago, on that work trip to Denver. You remember, the one right after I got that bad performance review from my old manager. I was a mess that whole trip, Kevin, more than I ever told you, because I didn't want you carrying my work stress on top of everything else going on. Aaron was the one who actually noticed. He pulled me aside after a group dinner, just to check if I was okay, and I ended up telling him everything. Way more than I should have told a coworker, but he was just so present about it, asking questions and actually waiting for the answers instead of just nodding along while thinking about something else. That night, walking back to my room, he hugged me goodnight, just a normal, supportive hug, and I remember standing there afterward thinking, that felt nice, and not examining at all why it felt so significant, or what it said about everything else going on in my life that apparently didn't feel that way anymore. That was the first real lie, if I'm honest. Not to you, to myself. I told myself it was just a friendly hug between coworkers, nothing that meant anything. Even though some part of me already knew I was building a justification for something I hadn't even done yet. The first time anything physical happened was about 2 months later at a hotel during another work trip. I told myself, walking into that it was a one-time thing, a mistake born out of stress and exhaustion, something I could file away and never repeat. I actually believed that, in the moment. That's what scares me most, looking back. How completely I believed my own lie while I was already breaking the bigger promise underneath it. After that first time, I felt sick, Kevin, genuinely physically sick. I remember getting home and seeing the framed photo from our wedding on the bookshelf in the living room, and I couldn't even walk past it without my stomach turning. I actually started avoiding that side of the room for almost 2 weeks because looking at it made everything feel unbearably real in a way I wasn't ready to face yet. I tried to end it once, maybe 4 months in. I told Aaron I couldn't keep doing this, that I had a marriage, that I didn't want to be someone who did this. And he was understanding about it, actually, which somehow made it worse, because even he could see clearly what I was risking, more clearly than I could see it myself in that moment. I lasted about 3 weeks before I reached back out, because the absence of it felt unbearable in a way that honestly terrified me more than the guilt did. That's when I think I finally understood I wasn't just drawn to Aaron specifically. I was drawn to feeling truly seen again. And instead of ever telling you I'd started feeling invisible at home, I went and found that feeling somewhere else and called it easier. The birthday toast. God, Kevin, I think about that night constantly now. I genuinely don't think I meant it as cruelly as it must have landed. I think I'd just gotten so used to thinking of Aaron as this central, important presence in my daily life that thanking him publicly felt automatic to me, in a way that should have terrified me about how far things had actually drifted, instead of just embarrassing me after the fact. And yes, we did disappear together that night. Not for ice. I'm done lying about the small things now that the big thing is already out in the open. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't even know if I've started forgiving myself yet, and I'm not sure I will for a long time. I just needed you to actually hear all of this, instead of just the short, ugly version I might have given you if you hadn't already had every piece of proof sitting right here on this table. The dining room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I sat across from her, the evidence still spread between us, and felt something strange settle over me. Not quite the devastation I'd braced myself for over the preceding weeks, but something closer to a vast, exhausted clarity, the particular stillness that comes after a storm has finally, completely broken. 10 months, I said finally. 11 hotel visits. A toast at my own birthday party thanking the man you were sleeping with, in front of 40 people, before you even mentioned my name. I know, she said quietly. I know how that sounds. I know how it was. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said. I have everything documented, the emails, the financial records, the photographs from the conference. I'm filing for divorce, Brittany. I'm not interested in trying to rebuild on top of this. Something in her face crumpled fully then, the careful composure she'd maintained through most of the confession finally giving way. Is there really nothing I can do? I'll go to therapy. I'll end everything with Aaron completely, today, right now if you want me to call him in front of you. Please, Kevin, we have 9 years. You had 9 years, I said, and you spent the last one of them building an entire separate life with someone else, then thanked him publicly at my birthday party while I stood there having no idea what I was actually watching. I don't think there's a version of therapy that undoes that kind of betrayal for me. I think there's just the truth, finally, and a decision about what happens next. She didn't argue further. She just sat there, crying quietly, and for the first time in months, that felt like the most honest thing in the room. Not a performance, not a calculated appeal, just the real weight of what she'd actually done finally landing fully, for both of us at the same time. The weeks following the confrontation moved with a strange, dual texture. The legal process advancing with methodical, almost soothing precision, while my personal life felt like wading through wet concrete, every ordinary task taking twice the effort it used to. Diane moved quickly once she had the full documentation. The financial records alone, 11 hotel charges quietly absorbed into our joint statements over 7 months, gave me significant leverage in the asset division, and the email thread, with its damning specificity about deliberately deceiving me, removed any ambiguity about who bore responsibility for the marriage's collapse. Brittany, true to her word in that final dining room conversation, didn't fight the divorce process itself, though she made several more attempts at reconciliation in the weeks that followed. A long, handwritten letter left on my car, a voicemail late one night, an offer to attend couples counseling even after I'd made clear the marriage itself was over. I didn't respond to most of it, not out of cruelty, but because I'd come to understand, with Diane's gentle guidance and a few sessions with a therapist of my own, that declining to participate in someone else's guilt isn't the same as punishing them for it. Her remorse, however genuine it might have been, was hers to carry. My peace didn't require me to manage it for her. Jordan remained a constant presence throughout, the way he had been since the very first uneasy conversation at my birthday party. "You know what gets me," he said one evening, weeks into the process, as we sat on my porch with takeout neither of us had bothered plating properly, "is the toast. Out of everything, that's the detail I keep coming back to." She didn't even try to hide it. She just thanked him, out loud, in front of everyone, like it didn't even occur to her how it would look. "I think that's exactly it," I said. By that point, Aaron wasn't a secret to her anymore, even if he was still a secret from me. The lines had already blurred enough in her head that thanking him felt natural, not dangerous. It was a detail I returned to often in the months that followed. How the most damning piece of evidence had actually been delivered publicly, in plain sight, months before I'd assembled enough proof to fully understand what I was looking at. I'd spent so long assuming betrayal would announce itself dramatically, with some unmistakable, singular moment of discovery. Instead, mine had been hiding in plain sight at my own birthday party, disguised as nothing more than an awkward, slightly tone-deaf toast. Aaron, as it turned out, didn't fare particularly well in the aftermath either. Word traveled, as it tends to, through Brittany's workplace once the divorce became common knowledge among mutual friends, and a colleague mentioned to Jordan, almost in passing, that this hadn't been Aaron's first affair with a married coworker, that he had, in fact, a documented pattern stretching back several years, something Brittany apparently hadn't known or had chosen not to ask about, when she'd let herself believe their connection was something uniquely significant. Within a few months of our divorce finalizing, Brittany and Aaron had stopped seeing each other entirely, a development I learned about secondhand, with a complicated mixture of vindication and a kind of weary, distant sympathy I hadn't expected to feel toward her. I moved into a smaller place across town about 4 months after the confrontation. A clean, simple apartment that felt, despite its modest size, considerably more like my own life than the house I'd shared with Brittany ever had in those final months. I started running again, something I'd let lapse years earlier without quite noticing when or why. I reconnected with 2 old college friends I'd drifted from during the marriage, not because Brittany had ever discouraged those friendships, but because I'd let myself become smaller, somehow, inside the comfortable architecture of married life, without realizing how much space I'd quietly given up. I thought often, in those quieter months, about the version of myself standing near the dessert table at my own birthday party, clapping along to a toast that had unknowingly announced the central fact of the next year of my life. I'd spent a decade believing trust, once established, didn't require ongoing maintenance, that a strong marriage simply continued being strong by default, the way a well-built house continues standing without anyone checking the foundation. I understood now, with the particular clarity that only comes from watching that exact house come down, that trust isn't a structure you build once and then stop tending to. It's closer to a garden, something that needs continued attention, or it quietly, gradually, gets overtaken by whatever's allowed to grow unchecked in the spaces you stop watching. That realization didn't undo what Brittany had done, but it gave me something useful to actually build from, going forward, instead of just something to recover from. About 8 months after the divorce finalized, Jordan asked me, over beers at the same fence where he'd first told me Aaron's car was missing, whether I thought I'd ever trust someone fully again. I think I will, I said after a moment, just differently than before. I don't think trust and attention are supposed to be opposites. I think I just let myself believe they were, for a long time, because the alternative felt exhausting. Jordan raised his beer slightly, the small, understated gesture of someone who'd been there for the entire unraveling and was glad, now, to be there for whatever came next instead. We let the conversation move on to something easier after that. Work, a game neither of us was really watching, nothing that needed examining further that particular evening. I drove home that night with the windows down, the early evening air moving through the car, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something that wasn't quite happiness yet, but was unmistakably its own kind of peace, steady, earned, entirely mine. The most revealing detail in this entire story isn't the hotel charges or even the email thread. It's the toast itself, delivered in front of 40 people, months before Kevin had assembled enough proof to understand what he was actually witnessing. That detail says something uncomfortable about how betrayal often works. It doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it happens in full view, disguised as an awkward social misstep, because the person doing it has already, internally, stopped treating the secret as something requiring careful concealment. What this story ultimately traces is the gap between Brittany's internal experience of the affair and its external visibility. By the time of the party, Aaron wasn't a guarded secret in her mind anymore. He'd become normalized, central, woven into her daily narration of her own life so thoroughly that thanking him publicly felt natural rather than dangerous. That normalization is its own kind of warning sign, distinct from the more obvious markers like secretive texting or canceled dinners. When someone stops being careful about hiding a betrayal, it often means the betrayal has stopped feeling, to them, like something shameful enough to hide. This doesn't make Brittany's actions more forgivable. If anything, the specificity of her own confession, particularly the line about deliberately choosing hotels because Kevin would never think to look there, reveals a level of calculated awareness that complicates any reading of this as simple emotional drift. She knew, throughout, that what she was doing required active deception, even as she also genuinely seemed to believe, in the moment, that each individual choice was survivable, containable, separate from the larger picture it was actually building. Kevin's blind spot, his assumption that a decade of stability removed the need for ongoing attention, didn't cause what Brittany chose to do, but it did create the specific conditions in which her deception could operate for nearly a year before he assembled enough evidence to see it clearly. The story is honest about this without excusing her. Trust without attention isn't security. It's simply unmonitored risk, and Kevin's own reflection, late in the story, about mistaking trust and attention for opposites, suggests he understands this distinction now in a way he didn't before the affair forced him to. The actual turning point in this story wasn't the toast itself, dramatic as it was in retrospect. It was Kevin's decision, weeks later, to apply the same professional scrutiny to his own finances that he applied daily to his clients' accounts. That single shift in perspective, treating his own life with the rigor he'd always reserved for other people's problems, is what transformed scattered suspicion into an actual, documented case. And it's the decision from which every subsequent piece of leverage in the divorce ultimately flowed. What lingers longest in this story isn't the affair's discovery, but its aftermath for Aaron specifically. The revelation that this wasn't an isolated lapse, but part of a recognizable pattern he'd apparently repeated with other married co-workers before Brittany. That detail reframes the entire narrative slightly. Brittany may have genuinely believed her connection with Aaron was singular and meaningful, when in fact she'd stepped into a role he'd already rehearsed before, with someone else's marriage, under circumstances that likely felt just as significant to him in the moment as they did to her. What stays with me most about this story is how publicly the truth was actually hiding. Kevin spent weeks afterward replaying that birthday toast, searching for the moment he should have known, and the answer, uncomfortably, is that the moment was right there, in front of 40 witnesses, the entire time. Nobody else caught it either. That's worth sitting with. I think that's the harder lesson buried in this story. We assume betrayal requires darkness, secrecy, careful concealment, and sometimes it does. But sometimes the people closest to us simply stop being careful because the thing they're hiding has already become, to them, less of a secret and more of a second life running quietly in parallel. The real growth here isn't catching the lie. It's learning that attention, sustained and ongoing, is what trust actually requires, not as suspicion, but as care.